All right, how is everyone? Good. It's not super freezing or super hot outside.
Nice.
Good.
It's kind of, I started early this morning, had way too much coffee, so if I don't seem super lucid, then I'll turn it over to James. But I wanted to introduce James Hopkins, Professor Hopkins. He's in the U of A College of Law. He's a faculty member in the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy program. He's also Algonquin and Metis from Quebec, Canada. And he's a faculty member of the American Indian Studies, GIDP, as well as, he's a faculty advisor for our minor program and also for the NRT. Well, I would assume you're going to be a faculty member on the minor program as well, but he's a faculty advisor on the NRT grant. And an affiliate in Latin American Studies. So as you can imagine, he's a legal scholar that is doing a whole bunch of work from an interdisciplinary perspective. He's also a graduate of Harvard Law School. And before coming to the U of A, he was a law clerk on the Ontario Superior Court of Justice and was a faculty of law at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. Okay, I can't list all his publications in my introduction, but there are many. I can attest to that. He teaches courses primarily in international environmental law. And I also wanted to say that he's the director of the Riyaki Human Rights Project, which is really quite an amazing endeavor. I encourage you to look it up online and also to talk to Professor Hopkins about it yourselves. The Riyaki Human Rights Project, he's working with Rio Yaqui leaders and communities in Sonora, Mexico, in all sorts of ways, and also with the Yaqui tribe here in the United States in Tucson. His efforts mainly focus on protecting and supporting Yaqui traditional lands, water rights, community public health, and economic developments. And he also might today talk about the Riyaki Catfish. I'm a fisherman. He's obsessed with fish too. He loves them. So we want to hear him talk about the Riyaki Catfish, which is essentially, I would say, extirpated from the basin at this point.
From the United States, yeah. It's our most recent extinction in the United States. Yeah, it's gone.
So this is a very important fish, not only for the ecology of the Riyaki Basin, but also the Yaqui people. So without taking too much time for Professor Hopkins' time, I'm going to turn the floor over to James Hopkins.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for your kind words and introduction. And thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your busy schedules for joining me in this 1 hour journey of discovery and sharing. I always struggle with an introduction because the story, as it was once described to me by the UN representative on Indigenous peoples for Mexico, is like a 6-string guitar. Like, how did I end up in the Rio Yaqui Pueblos filing this massive land water claim case before the Inter-American Commission against Mexico, winning it, and then having to experience the calamity of Indigenous human rights advocacy in Mexico, the dire calamity, which gets us to the catfish. So there's a Bugs Bunny cartoon kind of plays out in my mind where I think it's Wile E. Coyote is always trying to get the Roadrunner, and it's always a series of escalations, right? Maybe I'm too old, I'm dating myself here with Bugs Bunny, but the coyote's always coming back with some bigger, more grand scheme to trap the Roadrunner. And really that's what my approach is to justice here, because there's always this resistance. And the reason why I fell onto the catfish was because it's a true story, which I didn't understand at first, and B, it's a story that, quite frankly, is hard to get yourself onto the sort of the dire side of the spectrum of human rights work in Mexico, right? So the thing to keep in mind as I begin is that I'm talking about Indigenous rights and Indigenous peoples, and I have a very clear idea about that. Like, I have experience in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and other countries working with Indigenous peoples. I'm from Indigenous community myself, but this is very different. So the things that make sense here in this room and throughout your day, they don't make any sense where I've spent a lot of my time. And so that's why it made sense to pick a catfish. And so, when we're talking about water rights, we're not talking about the law of capture, as you'll see under US law in certain jurisdictions, or, first in time, first in use. I got here first, so sad, too bad. We're actually talking about you are part of a very large family network with no intentions of leaving where you live, with no future vision of leaving where you live, and knowing that you live a shorter, harsher life relative to others because you cannot access clean water. That's important. Access, meaning volume and cleanliness, like potability of water. So your days, plural, future going forward, is defined in part by a systemic denial of accessible drinking water, right? And so that's where your world begins to twist, right? And so you have to keep that in mind when you're doing this kind of work, because if you go to law school, you get, in Western legal tradition, you get training in the delivery of legal services, listening to your clients, sitting down. And certainly when I started this human rights work, it was very much the same. We're going to couch this talk as a traditional story about land title and water rights, okay? But nothing else really kind of makes sense after that. So one of the things that I thought was timely in starting this discussion was to talk a little bit about the work that I'm focused on in a forthcoming book chapter. And it deals with the limits of human rights. And so you might think potentially that I'm not a proponent of human rights over the next few minutes. But what I'm suggesting at the outset is that there is a limit to human rights, okay? There's a limit to the institutional capacity of human rights decision-making bodies. And there is no limit in our expectations as to what those bodies ought to be doing, right? We know actually very little about these human rights bodies, and therefore the aspirational nature of human rights and the language that's used in human rights, the morality, the nobility, draws up an assumption that there is some horizon line when you're in a world of chaos like the one I'm going to describe, right? So you think that it's rational and it should work because you have an end goal. Human rights will deliver you from this chaos. And specifically, in my case, it's the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, which is an international decision-making body. It's established under the Organization of American States, right? Which is ironic because right now my thoughts are pooling in the first instance from German philosophy in this paper that I'm working on. And so there's a philosopher called Peter Sloterdijk who wrote a paper called Rules for the New Human Zoo in 1990 that in German philosophical terms set off a huge controversy. But I think it's relevant for two reasons. One is it's coming out of Germany, which as a philosophical school has had tremendous torturous debates about its own role in shaping what is the world. What should you expect from human rights? Right? Because you can see the paradox so close in our historical record that some of the titans, the giants of German philosophy became members of the Nationalist Socialist Party, right? Became active members. And so as a tradition, and if you're in school studying scholarship, you'll see how scholarship builds on itself, right? There's a narrative. And so what Peter Sloterdijk talks about is humanitarianism. And he talks about how we write letters to each other. And he calls them love letters. And they're love letters from the past. Plato's Republic. These ideas of old books and old language that's written down. And in my case, it's oral history that's passed on that talks about lessons and ideas and principles that keep us together, that keep us functioning, right? So there's certain rules that can be drawn from this, these old love letters. But it's really important that he says that we keep writing these letters and we keep passing this along. That's first and foremost the most important thing. Because as humans, we're very forgetful, and you're about to figure out how much you have forgotten, how much you haven't been told in a moment. But he hypothesizes that technology, this was back in the 90s, I don't know what bands were popular then, Duran Duran, you know, I mean, I was a hipster. But he hypothesizes that it's technology that's going to be something of the rot on this, right? Because it's going to break the chain of how we communicate and pass on humanitarianism. And I would just say humanitarianism, very basic, in a basic description, is just an appreciation for the collective interest, right? Like working together for the betterment of the whole, as opposed to the opposite, which is totally motivated by self-interest in a very narrow, defined form, right? And the legal common law has lots and lots of examples of this under property law. Property law is a study of how the exception swallows the rule. When I teach property law, which I don't anymore, welcome, I would start the first class by casually talking about possession. And I would go over here, I would take your tea and I'd sip it, and I'd carry it and I'd put it here, and I'd start talking about tea. That's a really nice mug. I would take that and then I'd put it over here. And you've heard that expression, right? Possession is 9/10 of the law, okay? So one of the really fascinating things about this work in human rights is that I can use the common law language of persuasion to convince the other side, Mexico, of a property right. Now, there's a whole language that has to be transferred. I mean, it took me 3 years of talking to my clients in hour-long meetings in these ramadas in the pueblos to get them to explain to me how they own their title in the pueblos. I know the history. In the most recent sense, 1937, Mexico is in chaos. There's still the sense that there could be another revolution, or the revolution could flare up again, right? So we take that for granted. We take for granted entirely the stability of Mexico. But believe me, chaos is always only just a scratch under the surface there. In 1937, President Lázaro Cárdenas, having fought in the revolution, having fought against Yaquis, who owned and occupied a mining town immediately south of the border called Naco. So during the revolution, Naco was taken over by Yaquis, who were very, very adept at mining, and they needed to pass the copper through that corridor and then move it west, ultimately for destination in California. So he had to take the city back. This was shortly after the First World War, in that era. And one of the things he makes a note of in his diary is, I just never want to fight the Yaquis again. It was just horrible. And he had all of the latest modern weaponry and everything, and still was only just a hair's breadth away from defeat with them. So the first thing he does in 1937, because this is the grandfather of the pre-party, is he breaks bread with them. And let me just quickly get into geography. So I've talked, just to be clear, I've talked about Sloterdijk. I've talked about this idea that there's a need to keep us together. He uses the term love letters. Human rights is kind of like love letters. That's what I'm getting at. There's a need, according to him, and others, to document our suffering. And that documentation and that kind of suffering takes on different forms. And what I've suggested to you is that human rights law is not equipped to deal with that articulation of suffering. But it is still suffering nonetheless that we ought to be aware of. Moreover, we ought to be aware of in the case of indigenous peoples, as I've loosely defined them, because of the changes that are underway in the environment, right? These are anthropogenic changes that I will share with you. They are regional anthropogenic changes, and I frankly could care less what any climatologist says. I've only ever had marginal resistance from a climatologist, but the rest have all been wholeheartedly interested in trying to get research money to go and figure this one out. So let me get into this short little history, and let me tell you where we are. Google Maps. Little paradox here. Google Earth Pro is free now. It used to be $500, right? But what's interesting is there's actually a book out on this, timely enough. Stephen Lewis has a book called The Fifth Interest, and one of his big concerns is that weather data is being commodified, right? So part of the challenge in the future will be getting access to real-time weather data, and I'll talk about that in one moment. But we can use Google Maps to have a shared conversation. What you're looking at here is the beautiful town of Tucson, right? Just up here. We're just here at the Tohono Nation, and then you can see Phoenix is up here. And as we go down, I'm just going to scroll here, and I want to point something out to you that'll tie in this whole business with Cardenas in 1937. Okay, so there's Tucson, right? There is the Highway 19. How many of you have been to Nogales, Sonora? Okay, so just as a show of hands, do you think the population of Nogales, Arizona is greater than 50,000? Okay, so the census says it's approximately 30,000. Do you think the population of Nogales, Sonora is 10 times greater? Do you think that that's accurate? Yeah, it's even bigger. The population estimates right now are at approximately 500,000 people. Yeah. So what's happening, and what's been happening really since the 80s, the late 80s, is that there's a sprawling buildup in this corridor here. And I mean, I'm just doing this because one of the things I said was I was trying to test you and to, you know, illuminate kind of what's happening even within our own backyard. So you have an exponentially greater population here. And does anybody know, and if you don't, I'm just trying to ask these questions in as basic a way to get the answer that I'm looking for. But do you know what the significance of this highway is, the number 15?
I was just going to say produce, like agricultural stuff that's coming off from Mexico, and other stuff illegally, that so-called illegal.
Yes, yes, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, no, so this corridor right here has huge real estate value for two reasons. One is the highway, the 15, it turns out, is the only continuous overland transportation route on the western Pacific slope between the United States and Central America. And it ends here at the borderline, that imaginary line, at the gate that you have to cross between Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora. So why is that? Well, this gets into Yaqui settlement and the reason why Cardenas got on a horse, he literally got on his horse, and trotted as quickly as he could down into the Pueblos in 1937 to sign a peace treaty. So the reason is all of this is mountainous terrain, the Sierra Madres, and then you have little offshoots. As you go south of Hermosillo, and in here you have the Sierra Bacatete. So you have this flat overland strip here that makes it possible for you and I to go to Whole Foods this morning and get delicious, organic, plump raspberries. And they are delicious, right? And they've been picked just recently as far south as Guerrero. So this link is vital. But even more fascinating to me, and because of time I won't go into it, strangely, if you look at this sort of weird quixotic mesh of roads at Hermosillo, they kind of all join in. The 15, unlike American cities, does not have a bypass around it. Instead, due to government corruption, and the individual, the former Governor Padres, is in jail now, among the things that he did was he took road money that was intended to bypass Hermosillo And he built essentially what I like to call the roller coaster, where you just go up on a big bridge in the center part of Hermosillo. Wonderful view of the city, wonderful. And then you drop back down into traffic. So when you're sitting there going, you know, I've driven it with people for the first time, they're like, this is really weird. You know, you're on these like old streets with speed bumps, and then you go up and down. And that was actually supposed to be money for the bypass. The reason why I mention this is there's an intersection, and I filmed it, where all of the overland trade that is destined for the western Pacific slope of North America goes through. It's an intersection. So one of the lanes is about this big. It's the 15, and then it has to cut through this center road system. And there's the hotel, San Sebastian, is right there. Like, think about the logistical importance of this road. You just have to stand there, and you'll see it right away. It's non-stop trucks, 24/7. Huge 120-foot-long double trailer trucks with pork, produce, finished consumer goods like refrigerators, cars, 24/7, rumbling in, right, hitting this big, huge traffic jam, taking a right, and then, you know, slowly bumping their way through the city, and then they're back out onto the toll highway again. So to me, that was really kind of fascinating to kind of put this into the context of modern Mexico. But as we go further south, the importance of what I'm getting at is right in here. So along the 15, you'll be driving. This area is very much kind of westernized. There's a number of U.S. enclaves, essentially year-round residents, and the highway is quite nice, and you'll notice that they're putting in this huge new highway system through here. But the Yaquis have what's called the traditional territory, which essentially is up in here. It in the pre-contact era can be documented to San Carlos, which is, it should be, San Carlos is right here. There's a peak, if you ever go to San Carlos, called Titacahue, which is this beautiful, unusual peak that sits out in the harbor. And that was a demarcation point for the most northern coastal boundary of the Yaquis. And it goes all the way down into here, past a little town down here called Lobos. This is all drainage. So out of this beautiful, incredibly mineral-rich mountain range, you have the river meeting the sea. And the first contact, this is the Rio Yaqui coming through here. This is the last, most southern reservoir that supplies all of the city of Obregon and the eastern irrigation districts that are essentially privately owned. So this produces 3/5 of Mexico's wheat and corn, right, which is one of the most valuable mainstream export crops for them. So this water is really important for the survival of this region, right? So Cardenas comes in 1937, and he knows the Yaquis basically occupy and claim this whole area, and there's never been any dispute about this, because interestingly, the Yaquis had 20 years notice of Spanish arrival in Mexico. So one of the really interesting things about Mexican history, unlike the US, is that indigenous groups had lots of documentation about what the Spanish were doing. And the one thing that horrified them all was the practice of slavery and the slaughter. So the Yaquis had 20 years to arm themselves for the imminent arrival of the Spanish, which happened. And so, you know, you have these in Canada, you know, Canada Post likes to run these national historical commercials like the founding of Canada and this friendly little lakefront handshake and Canada spelt with a K. Well, the first interaction occurs right in here, and it's warfare. So the Spaniards, you know, they bring some priests with them. They know, they've heard about the Yaquis from the Mayos. They've heard that they're all, you know, amped up essentially. They're very aggressive and they're expecting something. And the Yaquis don't actually come out and say hello. They just engage in open warfare, and the Spanish have to retreat and they suffer casualties immediately. That first encounter defines why, over the course of history, why a Mexican president concerned about the future of Mexico would want to just, first thing, go break bread with the Yaquis. So it's not insignificant that Cardenas came here, because if you can see, there's a huge mountain range here. If you want to run a rail line, which in the 1800s was done, you have to cut through here. You have to go through Yaqui territory. And so there's episodic history of warfare. And in fact, by 1916, there's a peace treaty where the Yaquis agree to surrender their arms. And they're really, really well organized. They've been living here since time immemorial, and they're just incredibly well organized. So the point of this is that Cardenas knew why you need to break bread with the Yaquis. And it goes without saying that the Yaquis understood what he was saying. What he said and put into writing is that the Yaquis will be granted their territory. There's a dispute over the size of it, but it's pretty clear it goes all the way up into here before this reservoir was made. It also includes, and this is vital, 50% of the river flow of the Rio Yaqui, and all reasonable use as necessary and needed for cultural means. So he figured, you're going to get half the water. This was Mexico's 10th largest river. We're going to give you half, and whatever else you need. Oh, and by the way, we're about to undergo this big modernization project. I'm going to guarantee you that reserve of 50% in a dam about 90 kilometers south of the US border called Angostura. Okay? So this goes into writing, it's documented, it's even put in the Federal Registrar. It's put out as a federal announcement. It takes 2 years to get into the noticia, but it's actually put forward. Like, so this isn't just some sort of secret meeting, he said, whatever. This was actually a done deal. This was done by the most senior sovereign authority in Mexico with 8 pueblos, right? And so my story begins essentially around 2007 when I am asked to pick up the pieces of all these broken promises, right? Because, you know, guess what? They never got access to it. In a nutshell, and this gets to part of my exploration, and you know, there's a lifelong of stories to tell here, but in a nutshell, what happens is all of the water gets over appropriated upriver, right? So you can understand that if, I mean, you put water out in the desert, I mean, people are just going to be drawn to it. Moreover, this basin, which is called the Yaqui Basin, which nobody knows about, it's the most unknown basin in the history of the United States, but it's the largest shared basin between Arizona and Sonora. This basin houses the largest copper lode in the Western Hemisphere. And you know, Canadians always joke about how Americans are geographically challenged, you know, and I used to think, oh, come on, you know, that's not nice. And yet, in a weird way, it bears out some truth here. Because do you realize that the state of Arizona, which has a $4 billion annual copper revenue stream, approximately, do you realize that if they had just dropped the border, that line, 90 kilometers further south, maybe even only 70, they would have captured the Cananea and Caridad lode, which is the largest single deposit in the Western Hemisphere. But there's a whole history of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and how nobody knew what the border was. Like literally, when the United States signed that treaty, they had no clue what the territory was like. They had not done a single public land survey. They were just doing estimates. And you can actually look at the maps that they were looking at to sign this treaty, you know, and it was wrong. But incredible as it sounds, that basin to the north, the Yaqui Basin, this is the lower Yaqui Basin and the Yaqui Delta, it's all one integrated water system. And it's over appropriated, right? So right now to the north, there's approximately 24 foreign mining companies that have legal script, okay? A legal permit, a concession to water. And that water prioritizes, I use the word trump, and I used that word before the current administration. So that trumps, right? That takes priority over this 1937 treaty. Why? Well, but that's just the way it's been interpreted by Mexico. Okay, so we're getting into this land of paradox. So I just told you a story about these fierce, well-organized people. They have a clear sense of land. They have a clear sense of their resources. They want to make peace, right? And they agree. They come to a solemn agreement, and they honor their promise, right? And I want you to understand, there was a period where the Yaquis really held the balance of power in Sonora, and Sonora was, as it is today, the heel, the Achilles heel, if you will, of Mexico. It is one of the most vital, most understated geopolitical regions in North America. And I tried to illustrate that with this story of how you need to stay at the San Sebastian Hotel. It's really cheap. It's only $35 a night. Very nice, great buffet, and it's a great social who's who place if you want to end up in the local media. You know, sit beside the most well-dressed people. And this is one of these customs that I love about Hermosillo is the socialite custom of, you know, getting into the local paper about who's talking to who. But it's actually, so this is actually a piece of prime real estate. It's not forgotten real estate, and it's real trade. And the point is, these people suffer from it every day. So if you're a first-year law student and I give you this problem, there's this NAFTA toll highway, for example, that goes through their territory, literally goes right through their territory. Professor Hopkins, why don't we go on behalf of your clients and get some revenue sharing for them? Yeah, well, in 1996, guess what? The Mexicans did that. They came forward to my clients and they said, we're going to build this NAFTA highway and it's going to cut through your territory. You know what? We're going to charge a toll. We're going to scale the toll. You're going to get a percentage of everything. Okay, so here's the agreement. And get back to us, okay? I'll be right back. And then they walk out and close the door and they build the highway. They never come back. The Mexicans never return, okay? In 1996, the authorities filed an amparo, which is like an injunction proceeding, for another type of dilemma related to the highway, which is President Zedillo wants to remove from the Cardenas decree this choice piece of real estate. There's a whole bunch of plum and peach plantations in here. This is really amazing soil, right? So he wants to remove that. It's called the Cachillo, the decree of the Cachillo, which effectively removes the Rio Yaqui, which flows here, from the territory and shrinks the territory and puts money into trust. You should hear stories of Native American lore about this. The government puts money into trust for the compensation of the loss of land, okay? I kid you not. I've never been able to get a copy of the judgment from the federal district court in Mexico that apparently upholds the government action. And the lawyers who I tried to find, I've been told, have just disappeared. I don't think that they were killed. I think what happened was they were bribed and then they just took off to like the eastern side of Mexico with enough money to live on the ocean front for the rest of their life, okay? And the reason is Mexico put, do you ever see what's the movie, is it Austin Powers, Dr. Evil, where Dr. Evil comes out of cryostasis and he wants to hold the world ransom and he goes, I want $6 million. And they say, Dr. Evil, you've been asleep for 30 years, there's inflation. Well, they put pesos, okay? They put 45 million pesos into trust. Okay, I've actually been at hearings asking the Mexican government and getting them to give what's called an undertaking, which is binding in the common law, to provide a statement of account. There's this litigation in the United States called the Cobell litigation about lease allotments gone awry and the BIA shredding leases and hiding money, you know, like literally at the paper shredder, hiding these documents. And you know, that's for what's called a statement of account. Okay, so I'm telling you at the beginning, human rights is at its limit, okay? So to put this differently, okay, you all have to pay for your day-to-day costs of living, okay? So at the end of the month, somebody's gonna come to you and say, look, you need to pay for rent, right? Okay, so you go to your bank and you take your ATM card, you put the card in, put in your PIN code, and you go to pull the money out. And imagine the following. You don't get anything, and then the machine says, we are not going to give you a statement of account. Thank you for being a valued customer. And you go to the teller and you say, look, I want my account balance. I just checked, I have to pay rent. And what's up? And the teller says, no, I'm really sorry, but I can't give you that. And I'm just so sorry. Good luck, but you're a valued customer. Okay? That is Mexico. We have never gotten a statement of account. All right, a statement of account is the most primary feature to a trust relationship, okay? Without a trust, we have nothing. There's nothing. you can't have banking, you can't have an airline industry, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have any of that. And so we can't even get a statement of account for money that was like put away. And that's how tough this is. Meanwhile, as I said at the beginning, I want you to remember what the comparison is of the perspective, right? You're not getting access to safe drinking water. Okay, so what's happening in here, this calamity in here, to make it acceptable not to have a statement of account, right? So nothing's changed, right? So I filed these petitions. I have a copy of the Highway Revenue Sharing Agreement. I have letters to the previous presidents of Mexico asking for a basic statement of account. I filed to the UN, another principal UN body called the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. You know, why are these people not up in arms? And the story goes on. I have a YouTube channel where I've thrown up my exhibits. One is called, so if you go to the Riyaki Catfish Clinic project, just put in Riyaki Catfish. One, you'll see Annexo, you'll see some of the horrible things that have happened. One is, and Carlotta, this is the one that just blows me away. For a while, the government liked me and the people liked me because I was like one of the biggest redistribution agents of money. Because when I would sue in the commission would go to the federal government and say, hey, Hopkins says this. And they would say, oh, no, Hopkins is crazy. You see, we're fixing it. One of the things that I found out was the high infant mortality rates and the lack of potable water. And so the government says, okay, we're going to build a new state-of-the-art pre- and postnatal clinic. So I had this on video on my channel. And this is one of the low points for me was one of the weird things about this clinic. It looks beautiful. It has bilingual signs in Spanish and Yaqui, which I've since taken possession of. And one's down at the Paz Agreement tribe's administration office for evacuation in Yaqui. One of the weird things about this is there's these beautiful new concrete power lines, or electric poles, right? 30, 40 feet high, running through Pueblo Baco. There's something missing from those power lines, those power poles, the poles. What's missing?
Power line.
Power lines. There's a funny thing about this hospital in that it is beautifully manicured and landscaped. And yet at the parking lot, there's a roughly 15-foot fence, very expensive, and the barbed wire crest is facing outward to keep people out. And it's all surrounded and sealed. You know, so you sort of get the sort of sense like, what's that area in New Mexico, the mysterious area? Yeah, I feel like, I mean, did I just land into Area 51? Like, did some experiment go awry? So I have it in video where I hop the fence. Actually, there's already homeless Yaquis that have moved into the hospital. And I go in there with, who is now the chairman of the Paz Agreement tribe. We go in there with our little investigation team. And it's just madness. Like, so this whole thing was a sham. Like, so you can see delivery stretchers flipped over, some of them just out of the box, you know? So they never planned on finishing it. It's a fake hospital. And what just knocks me out is they have colleagues that I know at a really good university at a ribbon cutting of the opening ceremony. Now, I'm not going to defend my colleagues, but I'm guessing they weren't told that this is a fix. They probably, I'm guessing, because they're good people, that they were probably told, hey, you're going to get a medical clinic out of this, you know, and that it looks like a brand new thing and there's no fencing. So I tell people this and they say, no, you're crazy, man. No, but I had to videotape it. And like I said, the governor is in prison now over things like this. But this is very serious, right? So maybe we're expecting too much from human rights, right? So when I say, why are these people not like going crazy, you know, like imagine that in Pima County, right? I mean, there would be a criminal investigation, politicians would lose their jobs, there'd be class action suits. Part of it is, you know, one of the major problems is access to justice in Mexico, but these people have an even bigger problem. And this brings in what I feel like might be my only contribution to this story, right? It's not a done, finished story, but it has to do with this tension between hard law and soft law. So if you go into law school, you'll see that there's kind of like two tracks. There's domestic stuff. So if you want to go do a slip and fall practice in Arizona, you know, you need to know Arizona statute law, you know, all that stuff. It's all very much statutory driven, but it's the codification of the common law with some twists and turns. If you go into international law, it's all soft and amorphous, right? And in a way, the Trump administration helps me a great deal right now because they are the most sort of anti-soft law administration, I would think, definitely in the sort of post-war era, but the only comparison would be just prior to World War I in the United States in terms of isolationism. So the United States has removed itself from the UN Human Rights Council. It's threatened to cut funding for any organization that speaks out against it. But by the way, that's terrible, right? That's not good. But I don't want you to think that it's just the United States that does that, right? So in the soft law, hard law debate, which I don't have time to get into in full, you learn that countries go through these episodic moments of self-interest, right? So the United States pulled out of the Paris Accord, right? This climate change agreement. Now that's bad, but I can also tell you that, you know, my clients don't understand it any more than people in the Trump administration. You know, my clients don't understand NAFTA any more than some of the people in the Trump administration. So what I'm saying is that, remember this idea of love letters, I think something has been lost that needs to be worked on in greater detail. In terms of how these things are communicated, right? Like why it's important, so people can make clear choices. But getting back to the situation here, Mexico has signed every single international human rights convention on the planet, and I'm not exaggerating. They have 4 international conventions on the elimination and use of listed pesticides, right? Which they continue to sell, okay? And they continue to use. So they're a great example of someone who wants to be a good international citizen, but just constantly violates these norms. So the reason why I mention that is the real reason I think why you don't see more calamity here, why there's been such a, I wouldn't say acceptance, but such a quiet response to the injustices is what you're looking at here. This is the Rio Yaqui, okay, once the 10th largest river in Mexico. Honestly, what I'm about to show you has never, ever been documented in any peer review journal that I can find, okay? So when I tell people this, you gotta go to my YouTube channel, I don't get any money out of it. I have a video where I actually confirm this, and I have a little report that I submit where I take a boat, myself and Chairman Valencia, we take a boat with 12 other Yaquis, and we go up the empty Rio Yaqui. Okay, so I'll emphasize that again. The empty Rio Yaqui. Well, you know, how do you take a boat up an empty river? Okay, it's not empty, it's the ocean. Okay, so pictures, oral history, walkabouts. There used to be a really big pueblo right over in here. The last person buried there was in 1952, the last Yaqui there. So the footings of all the buildings are still there, they're gone. In 1936, the governor of that pueblo wrote to Cardenas, President Cardenas, saying, thank you for this deal, but let's just be clear, my pueblo has problems with water flow already because of this Angostura reservoir that you just built right near Agua Prieta. So we want to make sure that you're good for the 50% flow because we're already seeing problems with it, right? This was in 1936, 37. It's gone. It's gone, it's wasted. What used to be in here? There used to be a mangrove delta. There used to be a wide variety of Sonora cottonwoods and other hardwoods. You'll find some of these things, and these things are massive. If you go to the Sonora town of Cocorit over that way, these trees are so huge that the Mexican Sonora Tourist Ministry can affix like 12-foot long steel salamanders and bolt them into the tree trunks to make them look really touristy. I mean, these are huge trees with the diameters that are wider than from the wall to the table, right? This area was just an incredible, rich, fertile delta. There were sea turtles, dolphins. If you look up in Wikipedia, there's a saltwater crocodile species that was listed, and we've talked to people about their memory of seeing those things up inland that used to travel up the river. But what's happened now is that the river's gone. Okay, so people say, well, what do you mean? Okay, so if you take a boat, your boat is going to stop here. You're going to have to walk here. This is all empty. Now, right now, there's been a ton of rain, so there might be some freshwater overflow. But all of this is desertification. So the ocean has gone underground, it's percolated up, and it's created these salt subsidence pits. This is the one where the Yaquis do salt surface mining, and they sell this really nice salt shale in Obregon. So, so they've managed to adapt to climate change, right? But I just want to point out briefly what we're looking at. Because this, again, I cannot find any peer-reviewed literature on this, and this is why a lot of people would like to study this, but it's been really difficult to get permission from the Mexican government. So, because I know you're having to absorb a lot here, but this is really one of the best documentations of how the ocean is actually under the ground. This is all pure white crystal salt. It is not indigenous to the soil base, right? But it's in situ now, and it goes down into the subsurface. So what it means is this is the ocean, right? So you can even just look down closer, and you'll see that it's not flowing. It's just a canal. And if you start looking at how it drains out, some of it you'll see doesn't make any sense. This makes no sense. This used to be a self-enclosed point, and they said, one of the elders said that around 1985 it collapsed and fell into the sea. So the whole sort of topography of their landscape is changing, and I don't frankly know where it's going to go because I'm not an expert, but it's an incredible area to study for climate change. And this sounds really awful, right? Like, oh, what a great area to study because it's such a great ongoing disaster. But that's not just me talking, okay? This is business. This is like the life of corporations. Oh, here we go. Okay. Two major things happened. One of them changed the course of my involvement in this area. One is Sempra, which tried to put in a natural gas pipeline that's integrated. Sempra Energy is a Fortune 500 company based in San Diego. It looks like a marvelous company to work for. On their website, they have like a little cappuccino machine. And what I'm getting at, I'm being kind of cheeky, is it's clear they have no clue what their international operations are doing, right? So one of the things in my paper is about corporate responsibility. And so this is a separate story, but Sempra Energy invested up to $1 billion into building this pipeline through the Yaqui territory. It was in the New York Times, and it failed. The community, one of the communities resisted. I was participating at the time. There'll be a commemoration for the people that were murdered on October 16th. Unfortunately, I ended up on a wanted poster for murder, and I couldn't go down there. Once this is one of my witnesses was murdered, and the elements locally said that I did it. I was teaching a class, but that's what's so crazy, right? I mean, the suffering goes on and on and on. It's just madness. But I was thinking corporate social responsibility, where is Sempra in this? And to make it really short, because I'm running out of time, one of the things that corporations have that indigenous peoples don't have is mobility. I'm not saying Sempra Energy in San Diego is a bad company. I actually think, and I know for a fact that they actually discovered late what was happening, but they took an investment approach. And so you want to know what they did? If you look at the map, they said, okay, well, rather than run it through this area, and I don't know if I played a role in this, I feel really badly about it. I told the government of Sonora that the ground is sinking. All of this is sinking, right? There's subsidence because the ocean's coming through. And this is the NAFTA highway, and then the pipeline runs here and it'll break, and it did break when they ran tests. It exploded right over here. The point is, what did Sempra do? They're like the Roman Empire. They have so much money. they can wait a century. So what they did was they went back, followed the line back south into Sinaloa, and wrapped it up. There's a pass in the north through the mountains. And they said, you know what? We're just going to build into that line because this is just way too complicated. So they left. The other thing that just happened, and I'll finish on this point, is this other company came in recently, and Constellation Brands, right? They make Negro Modelo, Corona, a bunch of other pop drinks. They're going to invest almost $1 billion US into Obregon. This is huge private investment, and they're going to do it to improve the water quality. They want more access to water to improve their brewery production and their drink production so they can export on the 15 up to here, right? And so I have to look at this again with suspicion. They have a sustainability department on their website. But to close, just because I'm running out of time, and I thank you for just listening to my kind of wandering rabbit hole here, but between this idea of the limits of human rights, environmental change, there's a limit on corporate social responsibility, right? And I'm not being cynical. I'm not saying, oh, you know, that's the last thing you want is corporate responsibility. I'm just saying that companies are mobile, you know, and they have to make business decisions. And so whether they'll make a decision that somehow honors this 1937 agreement is doubtful, but maybe, you know, in our lobbying effort, we can convince this brewery to maybe work with some of the community action groups that are in the pueblos to at least start this type of dialogue to answer the question, what can we do about our drinking water situation? Because they don't have any water. How do they get their water? To answer the question is they dig holes in the ground, and then you know, they'll find it in the subsurface, and then they'll just either tap into a pre-existing pipe, so they have no clue what they're drinking, or they'll spend their modest wage on purified water, which is just poorly treated UV treated water. So these are really serious situations, and I know it sounds rather dire, but the story isn't over. And again, these are self-determining people. They're proud. They don't want to leave. They don't want to move to the United States. That's what's really ironic. They have absolutely no interest in moving here. And they want to stay in their homes the way they have. And they're very tightly connected with their families. Ironically, in some ways, they have, in my view, much healthier, much closer, much tighter knit family connections than you see in the sort of nuclear model that you see in Western society. Okay, so that wraps it up. I'm sorry for talking too much, but I'll open it up if there's time for questions. Thank you.
Few minutes for what, 5 minutes left for questions?
Yeah. Have you heard anything about the state of Arizona working with Mexico about pumping up water, have desalination plant? I went to some kind of seminar on indigenous water rights and some other program I was at on water rights, but that was a potential program that they're looking into because the contractual agreement with California, Colorado, Nevada, and New Mexico, and all those water right issues that's going on off the Colorado.
Yeah.
So they were just trying to see about negotiating with Mexico to pump up, have pipelines up from that area actually, and to pump up water up all the way up to Phoenix.
Yeah, and so one of the things, that's a great question and great point. So one of the things I want to emphasize is go into this area of work. You have a life of work ahead of you, right? Because these are solutions that are to problems that aren't going to go away. So the Colorado River, unlike my mysterious little puppet show, the mysterious Yaqui Basin, the Colorado Basin is mapped, patented. There's a treaty on the Colorado. There is nothing on the Yaqui Basin. So that's the first problem, right? And that stems from the idea that there's not a lot of surface water on the US side, so there's not a lot of interest. But now if you want to buy some real estate, in the southeast pocket of Arizona where the Yaqui Basin is, the groundwater table is at 40 feet and it runs at incredible volume. And I've been out there, I've videotaped it, and I heard through the US Fish Wildlife Park manager that CAP has been out there already as well. Yeah. Why would CAP be out there? Well, because there's no water. I mean, if you have, they're drilling like 180 feet plus here in Tucson, 40 feet. I mean, that is liquid gold. So the point is, I have to use these soft law measures. There's a 1982 MOU, which has treaty-like status, called the La Paz Agreement of 1982, which puts a 100-kilometer transboundary ribbon along the border where each party has to talk to one another for environmental problems. And I've used that as a lever, but the reality is in Sonora, because they pitch this desal all the time, I mean, I just, that is so difficult. I mean, the amount of money and capital in an area that they have never done an adequate environmental test on is really suspect. But you can see it. Mexico is the highest consumer per capita of bottled water in the world, right? I mean, I told you a really bad story, but just remember, Mexico City is sinking, right? Up to, in some cases, upwards of over a foot a year. I'm not joking. You can go there, and if you're in the downtown area, look at some of the older colonial buildings, and you can see the sidewalk go through the surface. And that's because they're doing too much groundwater pumping on the aquifer. So that's why I'm saying there's actual real jobs in here. If you want to go work for your tribe, I mean, we just had a beautiful flooding through here. I mean, all of that rainwater, that's money. I'm not kidding, that is money. And if you want to test that theory as a tribe, go try to bottle that and see what the county does, right? The first thing they're gonna do is like, oh no, you're raiding our basin recharge, they know it's worth money, so.
In that area, where's the nearest, like universities, like the big towns that have the universities?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. So, it probably doesn't take a lot to overwhelm me, so I forgot to mention this. Like, my clinic is part of a partnership agreement, and that's why I'm really hoping to work with Professor Carletta Chief and her group of people. My clinic has an agreement that's in the master agreement between the U of A and Unison, which is part of Sonora's public national university system. So I have a partnership agreement there. It's centered around the Riyaki Catfish. Why the Riyaki Catfish? Because if I ended up on a wanted poster again, my employer will just say you can never go back down there again, right? So the fish is a goodwill harbinger of the good things we're trying to do. And it turns out that Canadians like that idea too. So Hermosillo has Unison, and then ITSON, which is an agricultural institute, is in Obregon. And there's two of the foremost experts on Yaqui public health in ITSON, and I'll work with Professor Carletta Chief on bringing them in. I have some funds to have them come and do a talk. Dr. Mercedes Metis Garcia is one of the leading public health experts for this region. They tried to fire her, but interestingly, Mexico's employment laws are really strict, so they promoted her to the director of pig operations to get her out of community public health. So, but she's done some amazing work. Yeah.
All right. I think we're out of time. So let's thank Professor Hopkins again. Lots to think about. Very interesting. Thank you.
Can we email you with additional questions, please?
Oh, yeah. If you have any questions at all, yeah, please. I'm at hopkinsj@email.arizona.edu.
Thanks, I'll share that.
I got a YouTube channel.
Yeah,
Check out the YouTube channel.
yeah, I'm gonna email
Yeah, so this is on the
everybody.
catfish. Yeah, the Goodwill program. Bringing little catfish to.
I'll be in that valley where the headwaters are. I'm gonna have a gear tag.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. It's incredibly beautiful area.
It is. So I go east of there into the Palencios. There's a McDonald. Have you met Bill McDonald? You probably
I've heard of it.
Yeah.
It's
He's still down there. He started, he co-founded the Mountain High Border.
Yeah. They've done some really neat
He's a
work.
cool guy. And his wife,
Yeah,
they still run it.
Yeah.
No, yeah, it's a good guy to know.
Well, it's more about the method.
Access.